Good evening and welcome to Zoom Out, the Sovereignty Movement series of Zoom sessions addressing the most pressing and meaningful issues on today's agenda. This evening, we have the great honor of hosting former Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, first in Hebrew and now in English. Yoram Ettinger is a senior diplomat and an expert on U.S.-Israel relations. Yoram has served as consul at Israel's embassy in the United States, as well as director of the government press office. Yoram is also a member of the American-Israeli Demographic Research Group, which closely examines the demographic reality in Israel, particularly in Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip. The group's research consistently shows that the so-called demographic threat, as presented over the years, is not supported by accurate data. In fact, Yoram demonstrates that in recent years, a significant shift has taken place with demographic trends working in favor of the Jewish majority. At the Sovereignty Movement, we have had the privilege of knowing Yoram as a close friend for many years, a true partner in our efforts, a member of our Sovereignty Forum, and someone who always steps forward with dedication and readiness to contribute to every mission. Yoram brings a rare combination of deep diplomatic experience, independent thinking, and unwavering optimism. He's not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom, offering a clear-eyed yet encouraging perspective on Israel's strategic reality. And this evening, we explore a question that concerns so many of us: the United States, a paper tiger or a reliable ally? Yoram, thank you for being with us. We thank Hallel, Toda Hallel, for the taking care of the Zoom session. And Yoram, the floor is yours. The way it goes is we will close our microphone till the end. Yoram will speak for 30 minutes, and then anybody who wants will be able to ask questions as much as Yoram agrees to talk after this long evening. Bevakasha.
Okay, thank you very much. U.S.-Israel relations of the last 78 years feature systematic pressure on Israel by American presidents. Started with Truman in 1948, prior to Declaration of Independence, during the War of Independence, and following the War of Independence, until basically today. Obviously, today, minor forms of pressure compared to previous chapters of U.S.-Israel relations. However, what is very important to note is that simultaneously with pressuring Israel by every single American president, and sometimes punishing Israel by suspension of delivery of combat aircraft, suspension of defense cooperation agreements, simultaneously the strategic cooperation between the two countries has surged beyond the most optimistic assessments, not only of 78 years ago, even 5 years ago, even 4 years ago. The cooperation between the two countries has reached dramatic levels, as we currently see in the current war against Iran. This cooperation was not always there, and in fact, we have seen a period of time when Israel was regarded as a liability, as a burden. In fact, when the War of Independence was over, then the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staffs in the U.S., General Omar Bradley, recommended to the U.S. to accord Israel a similar posture or a similar role as was accorded at that time to the true prime strategic allies of the U.S. in the Middle East, Turkey and Iran. The recommendation by Omar Bradley, which was based on the Israeli operation during the War of Independence, that recommendation was dismissed without any serious discussion by the State Department, by the CIA, and by the Pentagon. However, a dramatic change has taken place, and Israel was transformed from a perceived or misperceived liability into a perceived asset back in 1967, following the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War transformed Israel from a country which induced neighbors to plan attacks, which induced more and more terrorism, into a country which for the first time deterred, in a substantial manner, deterred wars and has deterred wars and has deterred terrorism, not eliminating it. But compared to pre-67, Israel has gained remarkably in the area of posture of deterrence, particularly because of gaining control over the eastern mountain ridge of Judea Samaria, the mountain ridge which controls the Jordan Valley, and the western mountain ridge which controls the coastal plain of Israel. That Israeli control has been for many, many years also a major line of defense or major line of deterrence in the service of the Hashemite, the pro-American Hashemite regime in Jordan. Some of you may remember back in 1970, pro-Soviet Syria invaded Jordan. The attempt was to topple the Hashemite regime and then surge southward into the Arabian Peninsula, trigger effects inside Saudi Arabia, inside the United Arab Emirates, inside Bahrain and Kuwait, and transform the Middle East into a pro-Soviet arena. Israel was the one which stopped it when then President Nixon, who was unable to stretch a hand on behalf of the Hashemite regime in Jordan due to his preoccupation with Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. He called then Prime Minister Golda Meir. Golda Meir deployed more troops to the tri-border area of the Golan Heights, which is the border of Israel with Syria and Jordan. And within 48 hours, without exchanging actual fire, the Syrian military withdrew back to Syria as a result of Israel's posture of deterrence. The strategic cooperation with the US has been a very, very significant interest for the United States. Some people suggest that Israel has gained posture of deterrence because of American assistance to Israel. My own view is that Israel induced US supply of military systems. Israel attracted more cooperation on the part of the US because of Israel's posture of deterrence. Namely, it's not the affinity towards Israel which has been the major cause of supply of advanced military systems to Israel. It has been Israel's unique capabilities in the area of technology, unique capabilities in the area of intelligence, unique capabilities in the area of overall military, which has made Israel a unique ally of the United States. We have seen it since 1967, but especially in the last 2.5 years of Israel wars on, some say, 7 different fronts, particularly in the current war against Iran, which started back in late 2024, then June 2025, and now in 2026. And contrary to many people who assume wrongly that the US is rushing to save Israel from the jaws of the Ayatollah regime and therefore cooperating with Israel, the reality is very different. The US is fighting the Ayatollah regime, which for 47 years hasn't stopped assaulting the United States, starting with the takeover of the American embassy back in November of 1979, going through the car bombs which destroyed the US embassy in Beirut and the Marine headquarters in Beirut. Some 260 Americans were murdered at that time. A year later, another car bomb in the US embassy in Beirut, and then a series of Iranian Hezbollah collaborated anti-US terrorism, which targeted American installations in Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Persian Gulf, as well as in Iraq and in Jordan itself, and all the way to the blowing up of the American embassies in Tanzania and in Kenya, and then the collaboration with Al-Qaeda in the planning of September 11. A federal court in New York did decide as far as the Iranian involvement in the preparation for the September 11 terrorism, and actually also fined, so to speak, Iran $7 billion reparations to the families of the roughly 3,000 Americans who were murdered in the Twin Tower terrorism. The Ayatollah regime is not fighting the US only in the Persian Gulf and throughout the Middle East. It is fighting the US in South America, Central America, US-Mexico border, and on US soil. This is not my own assessment. Everyone can read FBI, Homeland Security Department, Threat Assessment of 2025-2026, specific reference to Iranian-controlled sleeper cells in the US, usually jointly with Hezbollah, jointly with China and Russia. And when the US decides to assault Iran, they decide to preempt the Iranian eventual assault also on the US. The cooperation with Israel is a result of their assessment, the US assessment, that Israeli capabilities should be leveraged in order to enhance, upgrade the capabilities of the US in the war against Iran, primarily intelligence, which has laid the foundation for the current war, as well as the Israeli Air Force, which obviously is not as large, as powerful as the American Air Force, but when it comes to surgical attacks, Israel is by far more experienced than the US Air Force. Israeli pilots are more experienced in do-or-die mission, much more than the American pilots, who rarely experience do-or-die mission. And then we obviously have the special operation forces, which I believe are or have been on the ground in Iran from day one. And again, the Israeli counterterrorism unit, Israeli special operation forces, have inspired to a large extent the existing American special operation and counterterrorism. When Israel pulled off the Entebbe operation, or the Jonathan operation of 1976, saving the hostages who were held in Entebbe, Uganda. That successful operation made the difference between establishing the Delta Force or actually dooming the Delta Force to oblivion. And the inspiration of the Israeli operation helped the decision to build the Delta Force, advance the Delta Force, which was the one that led the operation in Venezuela and is currently involved in Iran. When it comes to U.S.-Israel relations, it's not devoid of pressure. The fact that it's American interest to work with Israel, to provide Israel with the most advanced military system doesn't mean that we agree 100% of the cases. And obviously, there are instances where we have different points of view, especially when you're dealing the cooperation between the U.S., which tends to view the Middle East through American lenses or Western lenses or transactional lenses, business lenses, and Israel, which is not absolutely in touch with the Middle East, but much closer to the real Middle East than are the U.S. State Department, the U.S. White House in many cases, and certainly the U.S. Media establishment, research establishment, and academic establishment. When it comes to American interest, this is devoid of political pressure, devoid of the operation by very essential and positive organizations like AIPAC and different Christian organizations who are day and night 24/7 involved in enhancing U.S.-Israel cooperation. The fundamental reason for collaborating with Israel boils down to the dollar issue, to American interest. For the U.S. to establish in Israel research and development centers of roughly 400 American high-tech giants makes absolute sense. Why wouldn't Microsoft and Facebook and Google and Johnson and Johnson and John Deere and General Electric, why wouldn't they leverage the brain power of Israel, the various challenges forcing Israel to develop innovative applications? Why wouldn't they do it? And indeed, those 400 American giants maintain their global leadership largely because of their R&D centers in Israel. Why wouldn't the American military do the same thing? Why wouldn't the defense industry of America do the same thing? And indeed, if you examine the cooperation between U.S. and Israel, we're not talking about U.S. foreign aid to Israel, which has been misnomer for many years. The U.S. makes an annual investment in Israel, which is misperceived as foreign aid, and that investment yields back a return on investment, ROI, way beyond 1,000%. Now, that statement sounds too fantastic to believe and not very credible unless you get in touch with the facts. The flagship of the current war by Israel against Iran has been the F-35. Israel received the F-35 in 2018, the first country to receive it for operational use. At that time, the top experts in the US, some in Israel, doomed the F-35 project to failure. And they stated that this is a waste of money. However, by 2019, the Israeli Air Force, together with Lockheed Martin, the manufacturer, managed to fix most, if not all, the technological and mechanical glitches. And the proof is in the pudding. Not only the efficiency as demonstrated by Israel, but the fact is that the export of the F-35, which was perceived to be a doomed project, has zoomed dramatically. And during that time, there has been only one showroom which has been active day in and day out, demonstrating the superiority of F-35 over any competition, Russian, Chinese, French, British, Italian, whatever. In fact, last year, McDonnell Douglas published Lockheed Martin, the manufacturer of F-35, published its records. And according to Lockheed Martin, last year, $40 billion export. Now, I'm not going to be greedy and claim that the whole $40 billion is due to Israel. But certainly, we have been the only user of F-35 under battle conditions in such a systematic manner, in an unprecedented, intense manner, demonstrating the superiority of F-35. I think that a very conservative assessment would be only 50% is due to Israel. 20 billion. Now, 20 billion return on a $3.8 billion investment is one heck of an ROI. I'm not aware of any American investment that produces such a return so quickly. Not only that, every single day, the Israeli Air Force shares with Boeing the F-15, with Lockheed Martin the F-35 and F-16, as well as with the manufacturers of roughly 100 advanced military systems, which we receive from the US with much gratitude, undoubtedly so, but we don't receive it in a mode of one-way street. It's a two-way street. And every single day, the Israeli user shares with the manufacturer lessons. I heard from one of the managers of Lockheed Martin that the Israeli Air Force daily lessons, transmitted, by the way, through an Israeli team on location in Fort Worth, Texas, that those lessons have saved the corporation, the manufacturer, between 10 and 20 years of research and development. Research and development costs for the F-35 amount to $55 billion. And as that manager mentioned, 10 to 20 years equals to mega billion dollar saving by the manufacturer. Mega billion dollar bonanza to the manufacturer. The same applies to Boeing in St. Louis, Missouri, the F-15, and to a lesser extent, again, manufacturers of roughly 100 advanced military systems, American military systems, which Israel is using. We're talking about export, which has increased dramatically as a result of the Israeli showroom. We're talking about employment, which has expanded dramatically. According to Lockheed Martin, employment involved in the manufacturing of F-35 has expanded by 35% since Israel received the combat aircraft back in 2018. Now, the corporations manufacturing those military systems pay corporate income tax to the US Treasury. The employees involved, 290,000 Americans are involved in the line of the F-35 only, 290,000. They all pay income tax. If you compute the annual income tax revenues from the 290,000 employees' personal income tax and Lockheed Martin and the subcontractors' corporate income tax, you come to roughly $3 billion. That covers almost entirely what is called in a wrong manner foreign aid to Israel. On top of all that, we're talking about Israeli intelligence. Former chief of U.S. Air Force intelligence, General George Keegan, was interviewed by the New York Times, and he was asked, how come you're so enthusiastic about cooperation with Israel? And his response was, well, if the U.S. would have to procure on its own the intelligence it receives from Israel, the U.S. would have to establish 5 CIAs. To put it in financial or dollar perspective, the annual budget of the CIA is $15 billion. One CIA means 400% return on investment. And if you talk about 2 or 3 or 4 CIAs, you already are beyond 1,000%, and we haven't started to compute the impact on export and the saving of research and development and the increase in income tax revenues. But there is also the geopolitical location of Israel. Back in the 1970s, Chief of Naval Operations in the U.S., Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, claimed that Israel is the largest American aircraft carrier, which doesn't require a single American on board. And if there would not be Israel in such a critical area between Europe and Africa and Asia, between the Mediterranean, Red Sea, Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf, then the US would have to manufacture few more real aircraft carriers, deploy them to the Indian Ocean and to the Mediterranean, accompany them by 6, 7 ground divisions, all of which would have been immense burden on the American taxpayer. What type of burden? Well, today, 2026, to manufacture one advanced aircraft carrier between 10 and 13 billion dollars. Namely, one aircraft carrier means 340% return on investment. But certainly, Israel provides the US much, much more posture of deterrence than one CIA or one aircraft carrier. And here we come to the reality of the story of a relation between the US. It's not a one-way street, it's a two-way street, and it's a two-way street in a way which returns to the Americans, returns to the American taxpayers many, many, many times, exponentially more than the investment of $3.8 billion, which sadly is misperceived by many people in the US as being an expense in Israel instead of spending it at the home front. The $3.8 billion has been the best ever American investment made, and it highlights Israel as a unique ally, unlike the European allies, unlike members of NATO, unlike South Korea and Japan. And one example could suffice. The US invests every year in its European bases $35 billion, in addition to 80,000 American soldiers. I'm not sure that anyone can point at any benefit to the US from those $35 billion and 80,000 American soldiers, unlike the investment of $3.8 billion with no American bases, no American soldiers in Israel, and therefore the the determination by the US military, especially CENTCOM here in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, but also the Pentagon, the intelligence community, to enhance as much as possible cooperation with Israel. And I'll sign off here.
Amazing. Anybody who wants to ask questions? First of all, thank you very much, Yoram, for doing in Hebrew and in English an incredible work, and you opened our eyes. If nobody else, if you have a question, you can you can unmute yourself and ask a question. And if not, then I would like to ask the question that you did ask in Hebrew, if you let me. Is that okay? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I'm
Okay.
not sure
So
about
I
you.
just want to, you did said it's amazing everything you said, but in the end, here we are now in Lebanon. Our soldiers are there, and our hands are being tied by the U.S., not allowing us basically to finish off the Hezbollah, telling us not to go ahead. And how long is this going to take? That we have to isn't the time hasn't the time arrived to ask Yehudit Katsover that we sometimes can defy what they tell us, especially when we're talking about the lives of our soldiers and our sons who are in Lebanon now and who are basically like sitting ducks. That was her question, and maybe you want to answer that.
Okay, there's no doubt that the track record demonstrates that Israel can defy and many times should defy American pressure. Started with Ben Gurion, who in many respects declared independence in defiance of the US State Department, US Pentagon, US CIA, New York Times, Washington Post, and many of the advisors of President Truman. Same thing happened during the war itself. Pressure on Ben Gurion to end occupation of West Jerusalem, to end occupation of Western Galilee, Nahariya, Acre, to end occupation of coastal plain areas, Jaffa, Lida, Ramle, etc., and end occupation of major parts of the Negev. And Ben Gurion did not negotiate with the US. He simply said no and continued the war. We have seen Eshkol preempting in 67 in defiance of LBJ, who told him, don't you dare preempt, because if you will start alone, you may end alone, and we may even consider helping the party which will be attacked by you. And we have seen that with Begin bombing, destroying the Iraqi nuclear reactor in defiance of most vicious, brutal pressure by President Reagan, also suspending supply of combat aircraft and suspended defense cooperation agreement. Likewise, when Begin applied the Israeli law to the Golan Heights, similar American pressure. And we saw it not too long ago when Prime Minister Netanyahu went to Washington, spoke at the joint session in Congress in defiance of President Obama, criticizing the then pending nuclear accord with Israel. I don't have any specific information, but I think it's logical to assume that that presentation made it impossible for President Obama to achieve a sizable majority in the Senate, which would have ratified the agreement. And the inability to ratify it made it easy for President Trump simply to abandon that agreement, because unless ratified, it doesn't bind any president. And certainly, there's no doubt in my mind that Netanyahu's appearance in Congress, which until today rattles many elements, political elements in the US, but that appearance made a difference in the Saudi regard of Israel, in the Saudi high regard for Israel, likewise other Arab countries, which determine that if Israel has the guts to defy its number one ally on American soil, that is the proper ally on a rainy day against the Ayatollah regime, against the Muslim Brotherhood and other enemies surrounding. And I think much of what we have seen, the close tie, relatively close tie, without peace accord between the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and Israel, maybe the seeds were planted then in 2015. Uh, obviously, we don't know yet what is the final step taken by President Trump. I think based on his almost year and a half of second term, we have to assume that the unknown is much, much larger than the known. And many times, President Trump is using talk in order to mislead other parties, and we should pay attention to the walk. And the walk is the deployment of more and more troops. As we speak here, more American troops are coming to the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf area, and I think that tells us more about President Trump's strategy than his statements. Moreover, it seems to me that the last year and a half has attested to a very high degree of cooperation between the president and our prime minister, and all the assessments that the president is turning his back on Israel. The president cares more about the sheiks in the Persian Gulf than he cares about Israel. We know by now those assessments had absolutely no credibility. And I suggest that the same thing may apply to what we hear today. And certainly, in view of the very, very unprecedented collaboration between US and Israel, we should not rush into defying an American request to lower our fire in Lebanon. There may be certain agreements which we're not privy to, and certainly dealing with the head of the venomous octopus in Tehran is more important than dealing with the tentacle in Lebanon or the tentacle in Gaza. Myself, I think that much more must be invested in order to do away with the head of the octopus than to do away with the tentacles in Lebanon and in Gaza.
Thank you very, very much. It is great to see many of you. Dear friend, you have a question? Karen. I see
Yes,
Karen with your hand.
I have a question. I'm curious to know why you call the American regimes, past and present, allies of Israel. If we look at what America did under the Carter administration, in which they ousted the Shah of Iran, who was a friend of Israel, and replaced him with Khomeini, and then followed that route with President George Bush Sr., Ronald Reagan, and today, in terms of Donald Trump telling us when to start the war, when to stop the war, we're getting killed as sitting ducks, taking our orders from him. I have no faith in this so-called ally America, who has forced us into agreements time immemorial that have been to our detriment. And I think you said it all when you said we are not privy to agreements. Well, why not? We are the citizens of the Jewish state. If this is what they call a democracy, then why do we have no say when they signed the Oslo Accords, when they had the expulsion from Gush Katif, and wars in Lebanon, repeated wars in Gaza? Why do we have no say?
Thank you, Karen.
Why are we not privy?
Okay, I'm not again. I'm not an inner player in Israel or in the U.S., but I doubt very much as any statement which suggests that we are getting orders from Washington rather than Washington and Jerusalem coordinate and discuss and argue. Obviously, we cannot expect 100% agreement with Israel. But I think what we have seen in the last almost year and a half is unprecedented as far as cooperation at time of war. I don't think that too many expected President Trump to join Israel in the war against Iran in June 2025. I don't think too many so-called experts in the different TV studios that we watch almost every night expected the US to launch such an operation against Iran. And obviously, there are people who think that Israel should be more assertive. But let's also not forget that there are many, many people in the US who accuse Trump to take orders from Israel, who accuse Trump of being dragged into war by Netanyahu. I don't think either side of critics is correct because reality has presented us with a much more collaborative type of relationship than a dictatorship like of a relationship. Moreover, you mentioned, Karen, and rightly, Jimmy Carter's cardinal role in bringing about the Ayatollah regime. It was Jimmy Carter's administration that courted the old man, Ayatollah Khomeini, in exile in Iran, that forced the Iranian military to allow him to assume power in Iran. It was Jimmy Carter who stabbed the back of the Shah of Iran, and all presidents until Trump, all presidents, Republicans and Democrats, they all follow suit in different ways. Namely, they treated Iran through diplomacy, through financial means, sometimes imposing economic sanctions on Iran, but all that has played only in favor of the Ayatollah regime. The President Trump in his second term, unlike his first term, is the first American president to deal with Iran militarily. No other president has done that. And I think, and this is only speculation on my part, I think that President Trump's decision has been to distinguish himself from all his predecessors. By the way, going back to George Washington, but certainly going back to Jimmy Carter. And he wants to distinguish himself for the sake of his own legacy. And in my assessment, and I hope it's not wishful thinking, but in my assessment and in view of the huge military deployment, which is unprecedented, assembled by President Trump in the Mediterranean, or the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf, it seems to me that the president is aware, for the sake of America's posture of deterrence, for the sake of his own legacy, for distinguishing himself from his predecessor, he must not allow the Ayatollah regime to persist, because allowing the Ayatollah regime to persist is going to be declared, and rightly so, as a historic victory for Shiite terrorism over the great American Satan. It's going to embolden China not only in the Pacific, but also in Latin America, embolden Putin in the Baltic Sea and in Eastern Europe, and certainly embolden anti-US Islamic terrorism, which is already active on American soil. And it seems to me that President Trump, certainly his Secretary of State, certainly his Secretary of War, and the CIA chief, they are aware of the dire consequences of allowing the Ayatollah regime to remain in power. And as much as we deal today, in my mind, wasting our time, how much will it cost to bring about a regime change? What type of political problems, price of oil, etc., would it trigger? Rather than discuss that, we should discuss the cost of refraining from uprooting the Ayatollah regime. And above everything I mentioned before, the most critical impact of allowing the Ayatollah regime to remain in power would be not only another nuclear power, maybe not in few months, but in few years or in 10 years. It's going to be, unlike China, unlike Russia, unlike North Korea and Pakistan, would be the first ever apocalyptic nuclear regime, which would afflict humanity with catastrophic cost dwarfing any cost which we today discuss that may involve uprooting the Ayatollah regime, changing the DNA of the regime in Iran.
Thank you very much, Yoram Ettinger. Thank you to everybody. We will let you rest, and you can have more email. You can reach Yoram privately by sending him an email. I'm sure you get on the Ettinger report, which is always great to read your articles. Next week we have Dror Idar in Hebrew, and I will tell you about the English. Follow us on our website or on our WhatsApp. Toda rabba. It's great to see all of you. And Yoram, you're the best.
Thank you very much.
Kol tov. Shalom, shalom.